Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to today's segment on Lowell's history with Professor Robert Forrant and me, Maritza Grooms. In previous segments, we've discussed the influence of the women who worked in the mills, but today we're going to delve deeper into the origins of the labor movement in Lowell. So rewinding back a bit, once upon a time, the women were excited to come and work in the mills, economic independence and freedom, I can support my family. But then things took a turn. Days got longer, wages got lower. Can you remind us how they handled their discontent?
You actually just did it, so good for you. So the women start coming into the city in the late 1820s, early 1830s, but in a big way by the middle of the 1830s, 1834, 35. And when they get here, they're thinking they've been sold, in a way, a bill of goods by recruiters, that it's almost going to be like heaven on earth if they come to Lowell and work in the textile mills. And when they get here, it's hot, it's noisy, it's dirty, it's dusty. They see people all around them getting injured badly at work. In some cases, even young women are writing letters home that I saw somebody drop dead the other day when a bale of cotton fell on them and broke their neck and whatever. So the conditions are really difficult. And at that moment in the 1830s, there's not yet in the United States any kind of a legal mechanism for forming a union. There's not laws and things, which there will be by the 1930s. But it's going to take, we're talking about 100 years of history here, right? And so they will engage in walkouts, little mini stoppages, like shutting off the machines to make a demand about wages being cut and raising the wages. All easy for me to say, all those sorts of things. And so they're really some of the first people in the state on the ground trying to figure out how to organize. Shorter hours because the workday is really long. So women in Lowell are involved in trying to figure out how to get the workday. So we think sometimes now if we're working an 8-hour day, God, what a long day. Well, women back then would have been working 12 and in some cases 14 hours a day, 5 days a week, and then half of that on Saturdays, 6 or 7 hours on Saturdays. So you'd been working, 65, 70, 75 hours a week.
I couldn't imagine.
And with, again, no real leverage or control over your wages. And so some of the first sparks in Lowell and elsewhere in Massachusetts in the 1830s and 1840s are over arbitrary cuts in wages. But again, it's difficult to organize because there are no legal protections, and very quickly most of the leaders in some stoppage or other would be fired.
Right.
And when they were fired, they would also be put on lists that would circulate around to other mills in Lowell or Haverhill or Lynn or Nashua or Manchester in New Hampshire. Don't hire this person, she's a troublemaker.
And that also affected where she lived, right? Because who owned the boarding houses? Right.
If you were living in one of the boarding houses and you were fired, you also now, particularly if you had come down from New Hampshire or Vermont or Western Massachusetts or whatever, now what? So either you went back home or you tried to find another job. But again, if you're on one of these lists, it would be really difficult to get work.
So it might have been common to change your name and maybe go to another city.
Yeah, you might have to. You might try to, you might change your first name or use your middle name as your first name or, I think people probably would have tried all sorts of things to try to figure out how to, and again, sometimes if you went someplace, an employer might want a letter. Where'd you work before? Well, I worked at the boot mill in Lowell. Well, can you get a letter? But you've just been terminated from the boot mill in Lowell because you were organizing a work stoppage, so that letter's not happening.
But the fire started somewhere, and they started organizing little by little and little patches all over. But it started gaining a little bit of traction. Yeah,
so in New England, there's something that's formed that's called the New England Working Men's Association. And it's called Working Men, so I know there were women working, so don't write any letters to the station. But that's what it was called, the New England Working Men's Association. And it's trying to organize in all of the states in New England, and it's coming up with a common, almost like a manifesto about shorter hours, more control over wages, more control over speeding up the machinery because employers would be forever trying to get more work out of people. And as well, trying to in this New England Working Men's Association, they also formed the Working Men's Political Party. And they tried basically trying to reform law to try to figure out, okay, well, if it's difficult to organize against a single employer, maybe we can get state legislation for the 10-hour day. And so petitions are circulated, presented to the state legislature in Boston, routinely in the 1840s and the 1850s, trying to get a shorter workday. It doesn't work.
Right.
But those campaigns are ways to connect with lots of people, raise the issues, try to find sympathetic allies in the state legislature who might help with other kinds of worker protections. But again, in terms of legal rights to organize, in terms of things like a minimum wage, child labor laws, all those sorts of things are still going to be a long time in coming.
Right. So women couldn't vote either. So it's not like that they could take it to a political arena and say, well, here's our platform. So they had to rely on the Working Men's Association, right?
Yeah, and if they were married, they had to push their husband to wake the hell up and support women's right to vote and other things. And so, so it's coalition building. It's trying to work across gender, across occupation, and eventually as immigration really speeds up in the 1840s, 1850s, trying to figure out how you make common cause between American-born workers and new immigrant workers from Ireland, or eventually in and around Lowell from Quebec, or from eventually toward the end of the 19th century Greece. And so all these things, all these differences employers can exploit, which is what they do. Employers are very good at trying to figure out how to create wedges.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, and they're brilliant at it. I mean, to give them their due, they're brilliant. I don't like them, but they're brilliant in the sense of they can figure out how to keep control. And so they'll pay certain workers in the mills in Lowell more money than other workers. So German immigrant workers will get paid more than Irish or Greek immigrant workers. And the idea is that then if there's any organizing going on, the boss can go to those German workers who are being paid a little bit more and say, hey, come on, buddy, aren't I treating you okay? Why do you want to throw your lot in with, with the riffraff, the Irish or the Greeks or whatever? And so that can be highly effective. And it takes a while for workers to understand and overcome those differences, and again, try to figure out a way to make common cause.
Right. So before the immigrants came into the mills, it took for vast amounts of women to leave. But they were leaving because of the unfair wages, the unfair working conditions, the dangerous working conditions. And as they're leaving, they start forming strikes. Can you tell us more about the strikes?
So a lot of times in Lowell, in particular, in the early 1830s and again in the 1840s, 1850s, sometimes it will only be a single mill. So maybe the Merrimack Mill or the Hamilton Mill or the Boot Mill or the Wanalancet Mill across the way, whatever, or the mills right here in the complex where we're sitting this morning. It might just be a single mill where wages had been slashed and workers are organized enough to just basically shut off their machines.
Wow.
And walk out. And they're hoping that if they walk out and then they walk across, say they're in the boot mill, and then they walk across town to the mills over on Jackson Street or whatever, let's say, maybe then they can yell in the windows and persuade, their friends in those mills to walk out and join them. That's really hard, and that's one of the things that slows organizing. Again, without the legal protections to be fired if you're union organizing or whatever, then it's hard. And the mills are able to bank on the fact that there are lots of people looking for work. And so they're able to take advantage of the difficult economic times in the country, and again, the influx of newer workers coming in who are also looking for work, who are leaving really difficult circumstances, if it was the Irish, let's say, from the potato famine or whatever. And so for most of the period before the Civil War, for workers in big mills like textile mills or boot and shoe factories, things like that, employers have the upper hand. Where workers gain leverage first are in what we would call the skilled trades. So in Lowell, for example, specifically, in Lowell there's something called the Lowell Machine Shop, which built lots of the textile machinery for the mills in the city, built a lot of the gears and metal workings and whatnot that operated the canals, also built railroad locomotives. It was really this very cool place, and it hired lots and lots of skilled workers, and it also needed just everyday sort of runabout people just doing basic stuff, right? And unions organized those skilled people. So you would organize, for example, in a place like that, there would be people who would design machines and make the molds or the patterns that would then produce the metal parts that would be assembled to make a machine. They had a tremendous amount of skill, and they had a skill that was not easy to learn. Most of them probably had an apprenticeship for 4 years, maybe 7 even, starting when they were 14 or 15, and they were irreplaceable. And so when they organized and walked out, so 25 or 30 people in a workspace that might employ 500 people could shut the whole place down. Because without their working, everything ground to a halt. And so that's where the leverage was. So not just in Lowell, but in the country as a whole, the first really strong unions that come out after the Civil War are largely those skills. People today that would call it skilled trades. Like, for example, in Boston right now, where they're building a lot of new high-rise buildings, the people that are operating those cranes that you watch climb up the side of the building, bringing steel up and stuff.
Fearless.
Those are skilled trades. Those are people that have been apprenticed for a long time. That's not a random job you can hire anybody off the street to do, right? Otherwise we'll all be dead, right? So they have a lot of control. If they decide not to show up for work, the building stops being built.
Right.
And so employers will cater to those workers. And it also just so happens that the largest numbers of those people in the 19th and early 20th century that have those skills are native-born, white, American workers.
Oh, so they have the most leverage.
So they have a lot of leverage, and they're not really interested in organizing French Canadian workers or Greek workers, and they're very proprietary over their skill. They don't want to train lots of people. They basically, the way the labor market works, the fewer of them there are, the more money they make.
Of course, and that still works, right?
Still works today, right? If you're like a genius programmer, you're a genius programmer, and there aren't that many of them, and you can call your shots more or less, right? So yeah, it's the same thing, and so they can form unions in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So there are lots of unions of really like highly skilled electricians, plumbers, pipe fitters, mold makers, machinery builders, all those things, right? And they're called the aristocracy of labor.
Oh.
In the history books, that's what they're called, the aristocracy of labor.
Wow. So these people come together.
Yep.
And they're the ones who are going to make the biggest impact.
Initially, right? So they ultimately, in the late 19th century, they formed something called the American Federation of Labor, which is still around today, the AFL. The American Federation of Labor is largely skilled craft workers, native-born, and if not, then like German, Northern Europe, the so-called good immigrants, Northern Europe, Scandinavians, Germans. A lot of those immigrants coming from, let's say, Germany, are skilled. They're coming as a skilled machinist, and they can find work pretty easily. In a place like Lowell or Worcester or Springfield, and they bring some of their trade union traditions with them. But yeah, initially the American Federation of Labor is going to advocate for an 8-hour day, things like that, better wages, but they're not organizing the really big industry. So in a place like Lowell, again, in the boot mill or the Merrimack mills or whatever it would be, there would be unions. By the early 20th century, there would be unions in those factories, but they might represent like 1/10 of the workforce.
So how do we get everybody together?
Well, what starts to happen is in the period sort of after the First World War, so starting around 1920, industry has sort of dramatically changed, and more what's happened is employers, to get out from under the control that those skilled trades have over their workplaces, are figuring out ways to automate more, have more machinery, and figure out ways to do without some of those skilled workers. And so manufacturing in America is largely changing from that more skilled craft kind of work to what people would refer to as mass production. So initially in the 1920s, workers are suffering in those mass production industries because they don't have any form of organization, and the American Federation of Labor isn't really interested in organize those workers. But slowly, and especially when the Great Depression hits and when the stock market crashes in 1929, the Great Depression hits, and there's like just massive unemployment in the country, and in Lowell, unemployment rate in Lowell hits about 40%.
Wow.
1931, 1932, factories are, laying people off, business stores are closing. It's a really difficult situation. Out of the ashes of a lot of that collapse come people who say, wait, we can't just continue to organize in this narrow, exclusive way. And so these debates happen nationally and they happen in Lowell. And so people argue, and people actually politically struggle over whether or not the American Federation of Labor in Lowell, in Lawrence, in Haverhill, Boston, wherever, all over Massachusetts, whether they're going to organize these new workers, these unskilled, semi-skilled workers. And the AFL essentially says no.
Wow.
And so people in the AFL who have been advocating to organize more broadly break away and form something that's ultimately going to be called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. And so today we refer to the AFL-CIO, but the CIO started as a breakaway to represent more broadly mass production workers. And so this happens all over the country, and Lowell is in the grips of this really dynamic labor history that takes place in the 1930s, where workers are successful at organizing textiles, boots and shoes, all sorts of what, again, people would refer to as mass production industries, steel making, automobiles. The decade of the 1930s is this landmark for labor, and it's happening in the streets of Lowell as well. So Lowell's part of this bigger national story.
Oh, wow. And eventually, the other people, the lower rungs of the workers, they do unionize,
yes.
don't they?
Yeah, and so what happens is, as the CIO forms, they send organizers to a city like Lowell, or to Detroit, or to Akron, Ohio, or wherever, and they say, okay, what's going on, and let's find people. And there are people now willing, partly because of the desperate economic situations, people realize if we don't organize, we're in a world of trouble here. And so start organizing the boot and shoe industry in Lowell, start organizing the textile industry. In 1933, there's an incredible shoe strike in Lowell. So the textile mills start shutting down, laying people off in the 1920s, and boot and shoe makers from all over New England decide to come to Lowell because there's a lot of unemployed workers. And so in some of the empty textile mills, they basically put shoe factories in.
Wow.
And shoe factories pay pretty badly, and the working conditions are pretty harsh. And so workers in those shoe factories start to organize. So in 1933, as an example, on Bridge Street, right over by where Kerouac Park is now, and where Arthur's Diner is, that whole strip right there from the bridge up to Bridge Street, that stretch of Bridge Street up to Merrimack, that becomes like a battle zone.
Wow.
Because all the shoe workers try to get union representation, try to get their money up, their wages up, go out on strike. And the owners of the shoe factories decide they're going to bring in workers from outside Lowell to restart the factories. And the workers in Lowell aren't having it.
Yeah.
And so there are pitched battles on Bridge Street, and I mean pitched battles.
And it gets dangerous, right?
Oh yeah, gunfire.
Oh, wow.
People just don't want, and the outside workers being brought in are called scabs. So you can tell just by thinking of a scab on your arm, right, from a cut, whatever. Not a favorable slang to use. And so workers in these boot and shoe mills are going to do everything they possibly can to keep these scabs out. So hundreds and hundreds of workers show up every day to block the Bridge Street Bridge, to keep workers from being brought down the boulevard and brought in that way onto Bridge Street, and also mass at the corner of Bridge and Merrimack.
So protesters have been blocking traffic for
centuries.
Yeah.
This was the way to do it, right? And so, and the police would come, and there would be, and the mayor of Lowell was like beside himself trying to figure out how to create some level of peace between the workers and the companies. And so no, these were very famous incidents in labor history, in Lowell labor history. And then so there's a series of these shoe strikes in 1933, another big series of shoe strikes in 1937. There were big textile mill strikes in 1934 and 1935 all over the country, and Lowell is part of those as well. The textile strikes in the southern parts of the United States turn really violent. Lots of workers lose their lives. That does not happen in the textile mill strikes here in Lowell, but the violence in the South is pretty pronounced. Lots of organizers are murdered.
Oh my goodness.
Eyewitnesses see them murdered, and nobody's ever brought to justice for the murders. Just a really violent clashes in places like Tennessee and South Carolina and North Carolina, West Virginia. There are mine strikes, there are auto worker strikes, big strikes in the auto plants. In auto, people actually sit in and occupy the factories.
Wow.
They called sit-down strikes. They basically they say, why should we stand outside, picket around, and get beat up by the police and arrested? We should go inside, occupy the factory. They'll be more reluctant to send police in because it might damage the machinery,
Which is clearly more valuable
way more
than
important
the
than the
humans.
people, right?
Oh
yeah.
my goodness.
And so these, in one very famous case in Flint, Michigan, workers sit in a factory for 101 days.
Wow.
And people sneak food in. There's like
That's
this whole
incredible.
support system that's built up around the factory to get food into them and water. Eventually the company shuts off the electricity and the heat.
Wow.
Most of these auto ones start in the winter in like December and January, 1934, 35, 36. And they last sometimes again 2 and 3 months. And then the idea of sit-down strikes spreads to Massachusetts. And so even places like laundries that might employ 20 or 25 people, grocery stores, convenience stores of the day, all those, people now see this as an effective way to strike. Just stop work and sit in place.
Wow.
And so like later in the 60s when the civil rights movement employs sit-downs a lot and at lunch counters and things like that, or when students do that in the 60s and 70s on college campuses, they're really borrowing from that repertoire that workers used in the 1930s to occupy factories. It's a very similar, so I mean there's an interesting legacy there, right, in terms of the history. So Lowell's right in the middle of all of that history, and it's raging all around us. I mean, if we were where we're sitting now, if we were, 1935, 36, this would be swirling all around us.
Wow.
You couldn't miss it. It was in the newspapers every day.
I can't even imagine hundreds of people just walking on Bridge Street. Wow, that's incredible.
There were strikes so some of the early strikes, so there was the famous Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, which is a little earlier than what we were just talking about, but 1912. And when that ends, the same people that organized that strike in Lawrence come to Lowell. People like Elizabeth Flynn, who's called in history books the rebel girl. I mean, she's like very, if I was around back then, I would have wanted to go out with her. She's just this amazing character in history. Anyway, so she comes to Lowell, and this guy, Big Bill Haywood from the Industrial Workers of the World come, and they basically pick up where the Lawrence strike leaves off in Lowell, and they win this very famous strike in Lowell in March, April of 1912. And I was reading about this in the Lowell newspapers, and there's this great article where the strikers marched from downtown, from like Merrimack to Belvedere neighborhood, which is a fairly big walk. And they're looking to picket in front of mill overseers' homes at the time. And the Lowell newspaper, the headline in the Lowell Sun is "Workers Invade Belvedere." And I love that headline, right? I mean, but they would march from Merrimack Street. They would meet down, not too far from where we're sitting this morning. They would march all the way down Merrimack, take a left onto Bridge, go all the way across Bridge Street Bridge, over onto the boulevard on the other side, march down Lakeview Avenue, come all the way over the Aiken Street Bridge and back into town. Wow. And they would have bands, and there would be it would be this huge deal. There would be thousands of workers.
But it was effective.
It was effective.
They actually made change.
And they basically were able to, this was something that, unlike the AFL, the industrial workers of the world believed in creating this unity across different nationalities, and they were very good at it. So when people were marching, they would be singing everybody else's songs. They would be singing French songs and German songs and Polish songs.
That
and,
is beautiful.
you know, whatever, and that was the way to create this level of solidarity, right? You could much more easily learn a language by singing a song than by trying to, and commitments were made that all the strike material, the documents, the demands, everything would be translated, meetings would be translated. So the industrial workers of the world in many ways set sort of the standard for how, right, where we actually started back the conversation this morning. They actually started the idea of figuring out, okay, well, we have to figure out a way to create unity across gender and also across languages, across religions, all sorts of things, if we're going to have an effective labor movement in the country. So all of this culminates in 1935. So again, we started out 1835, young women in the mills trying to figure out how to create a shorter workday. 1935, we get legislation that gives workers the legal right to organize trade unions. It's 100 years later.
100 years.
100 years of struggle. 1935, the National Labor Relations Act is put in place, which gives workers the right to form unions. And in 1937, something called the Fair Labor Standards Act gets passed, which creates the 8-hour workday and has all sorts of child labor laws and other things embedded in it. So we're talking about 100 years of on and off again, but generally pretty persistent struggle to get workers to a point where, for at least a while, they had a living wage and a safe workplace.
And all of those impact the labor laws that are in place today.
Right, and all those things are at risk right now in terms of the political climate that we're in today. Employers are trying to claw back and take away a lot of the things that were won over this general period of struggle that we've been talking about.
And even similar strategies, the divide and conquer technique, and be aware of all of the immigrants.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, trying to create those wedges between immigrant workers and so-called native-born workers.
But if there's anything that we can learn from history, once again, people coming together, working together, like you said, across gender, across race, across ethnicity, language even, those barriers were not a thing. When you want change, you work together, you come together in unity.
It generally has worked in the history books when people have figured that out, that there's greater strength in that unity than being picked off one at a time.
I wish that people would really pay attention to all of these things that have been happening already in our own history. Maybe we wouldn't have to repeat so many of our same mistakes. Yeah,
and the thing is that most times, like this history that all the history that we've been talking about, which I've really loved doing, it's not taught.
No, and why?
So the things that we've just discussed, those don't generally appear in the high school history curriculum, nor do they appear very often in the college history curriculum. So while we say you can learn from history, well, yeah, but it has to be taught.
Exactly.
It's sitting there if somebody goes and digs it out. But if somebody doesn't go dig it out and then be willing to talk about it and teach it and do the work required to do that, then
But
what
that's
good
why
is
we're
it?
so lucky to have you, because
No,
now
that's
we
why
can
I'm
do
lucky to
these.
have you too, because these are great I mean, I'm sure that I'm reaching more people doing this with you than I would ordinarily reach in a year of teaching students.
I'm grateful. I know I'm learning so much with these segments, and I really hope that our viewers are learning just as much as the two of us are together.
Let's hope.
So I think the overarching message is, let us have unity. Let's come together. Let's work together. And maybe we can make change. Maybe we won't see it for 100 years.
Oh, God. Well, I'll be long gone. So.
And I bet that's how a lot of the mill workers, well, we wouldn't know how they felt, but I bet they would be proud. They would have been proud to know that their strides, their walkouts and their protests actually...
You're pushing the rock up the hill.
Exactly. So I have faith. We'll make change.
Okay, I'll ride with that.
Thank you so much once again for a wonderful, wonderful recap of our history and the things that are so important that make us who we are today and make Lowell the great city that it is.
Yep, absolutely. The history matters.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for tuning in.